The auction block at the crossroads of Salt Hollow had been in operation for the better part of a morning. By the time Caleb Hess walked his bay mare up the wagon road from the south and stopped at the back edge of the small crowd of perhaps 18 men and 3 women standing in the spring mud in front of the wooden platform on a clear, cool Tuesday in April of 1853, and watched the trader work his way through the last of the orcs he had been carrying west from the territorial capital across the previous 5 weeks. The trader was a man named Hessel Brace, of perhaps 55 years, with a thick brown beard going gray at the corners of the mouth, a long dark wool coat with brass buttons, and the careful flat voice of a man who had been selling orcs to frontier customers for 12 years. He had sold 7 orcs already that morning, 3 men and 4 women, all of working age, all of them in the chains the territorial law required of unfreed orcs at public sale, all of them now standing in a small loose cluster at the back of the platform under the watch of Hessel Brace's 2 hired men. The remaining orc on the platform, the orc Hessel Brace was about to put up for the 8th and final sale of the morning, was a woman of perhaps 58 years, gaunt to the point of visible bone at the shoulder and the wrist, with long hair gone mostly silver white, tied back at the nape of her neck by a single piece of frayed dark cord, with the bright, vivid emerald green skin of her people now stretched tight across the lines of a face that had not been fed enough in a great many weeks, with the prominent pointed elf-like ears and the 2 small lower tusks of an adult orc woman, and with dark eyes that did not lower when Hessel Brace called her forward to the front of the platform. She wore a long gray wool dress that had been a good dress when she had been bought into it 8 years before, and was now a torn and stained dress, and a frayed gray wool shawl pulled around her shoulders against the cool of the morning, and a pair of worn brown leather shoes that did not quite match each other, and the iron at her ankles that the territorial law required at public sale. She did not look at the crowd. She looked at the back of the platform. Hessel Brace had begun his patter. He had said, "Gentlemen, the last lot of the day, an orc woman of mature years, formerly the smith of a Stillwater village in the Eastern campaigns, healthy and capable of light work, sold at the Eastern capital 3 years ago for $9 to a household in the central counties. Sold last year at the regional auction in Foxwater for $4 to a foundry concern that found her not suitable to the work, and now offered to you at Salt Hollow Crossing at a starting bid of $2. Hessel Brace had paused. The crowd had not moved. A man in the front rank, a foundry buyer Caleb had recognized as a buyer for one of the large eastern operations, had spat a small, careful stream of tobacco juice onto the spring mud in front of him and had not raised his hand. 2 of the women in the crowd, the wives of the local farmers, had turned and begun to walk away in the direction of the small inn. The other bidders had been looking at the mud or at the trees on the far side of the wagon road or at the chains at the orc woman's ankles. Hessel Brace had said, "Gentlemen, the bid is $2. He had said $1.50. He had said, in a voice that had begun to take on the slightly thinner quality of a tradesman who was watching a sale fail, "Gentlemen, $1. Caleb Hess had walked his bay mare 3 paces forward through the back of the crowd and had stopped at the rear of the front rank. He had said, in a voice not raised much above the voice of a normal conversation, but in the cool morning air carrying clearly to Hessel Brace on the platform, "Trader." Hessel Brace had looked up. Calum had said, 1 copper coin. Hessel Brace had looked at him for a long moment. Hessel Brace had said, Sir, the starting bid was $2, and the law of the territorial slave market sets the legal minimum bid at 1 copper coin only for lots, which have failed to attract any bid at the starting price. Calum had said, Trader, your lot has failed to attract any bid at any of the 4 prices you have just called. He said, your starting bid is now legally retracted to the minimum, and my bid of 1 copper coin is the legal opening bid, and I am the only bidder on the platform. He said, you may close the lot at 1 copper coin, or you may declare it withdrawn, or you may continue to call no further bids and continue to embarrass yourself in front of the men of this crossroads. He said, please make the call. Hessel Brace had looked at Calum Hess for a longer moment. He had looked at the 18 men standing in the spring mud in front of him, several of whom were now looking at the platform with the small particular attention of men who had recognized that something was happening on the wooden boards in front of them that they had not previously been seeing. He had looked at the silver-haired orc woman in her torn gray dress and her unmatched shoes. He had said, in a voice that was thinner than it had been, the bid is 1 copper coin. He had said, going once. He had said, going twice. He had said, the lot is sold to the gentleman at the rear for 1 copper coin. He had brought his small wooden gavel down on the wood of the platform with a sound that the crowd of 18 men heard differently from each other. He had then said, Sir, please come forward to settle the transaction. Calum had ridden his bay mare 3 paces further forward to the foot of the wooden platform. He had dismounted. He had taken from the small leather purse on his belt a single copper coin of the territorial currency, dated 1844, slightly worn at the edges, which he had been carrying in his right pocket for the previous 14 months for exactly this purpose. He had held the coin up to Hessel Brace on the platform. Hessel Brace had reached down and had taken the coin. Hessel Brace had said, in the careful, flat voice he had been using all morning, the lot is settled. He had taken from the inside pocket of his long dark wool coat a small leather-bound book of pre-printed bills of sale, and he had filled in dark fountain pen ink in a careful, even hand, the date and the location of the sale, the name of the trader, himself, Hessel Brace, registered seller, territorial license number 4117, the description of the lot, 1 orc woman, mature years, formerly of the Stillwater clan, 8 years in slavery. The sale price, 1 copper coin. And the name of the buyer. He had paused at the buyer's line. He had said, Sir, your name. Calum had said, Calum Hess, of the farm of Hess, at the crossroads of Salt Hollow, freeholder of 80 acres registered with the Territorial Registrar's Office at the Central County Seat, County of Salt Hollow, Territory of the Central Plains. Hessel Brace had written it down. He had signed the bill of sale himself. He had handed it down to Calum. He had said, Sir, your purchase is yours. He had turned to one of his hired men and had said, Strike the irons. The hired man had walked to the silver-haired orc woman at the front of the platform and had unlocked the iron at her ankles with a small flat key and had lifted the irons off her bare feet and had carried the irons to the back of the platform. The orc woman had not moved during this. She had stood very still. She had looked at the back of the platform. Hessel Brace had said, Sir, will you be conducting your purchase home this morning? Calum had said, Trader, I will. He had said, may she walk down from the platform on her own feet. Hessel Brace had said, "Sir, you have purchased her. She is yours to instruct." Kylam had walked the 4 steps to the front of the platform. He had looked up at the silver-haired orc woman, who had now turned her face toward him for the first time, and whose dark eyes had been looking at him from the platform with the careful, flat measuring attention of a person who had been bought 4 times in 8 years, and who knew by now the small private faces of the men who bought her. Kylam had said, in the public language, "My name is Kylam Hess." He had said, "I am going to ride to the territorial registrar's office at the county seat tomorrow morning and file a bill of sale, and I am going to file a manumission paper at the same time and the same office, and the manumission paper is going to be dated tomorrow, and you are going to be a free woman of the territory tomorrow afternoon." He had said, "Between now and then, will you ride home with me?" The orc woman had looked at him. She had not spoken. She had looked at him for the length of perhaps 30 seconds, and Kylam had stood at the foot of the platform and had waited, and after the 30 seconds she had said, in a voice that was low and very quiet, but that was clear in the cool morning air, "Sir, I will." She had walked the 4 steps down the wooden stairs at the side of the platform on her own feet. She had stood beside Kylam on the spring mud at the foot of the platform. Kylam had said, "May I know your name?" She had said, in the same low, quiet, clear voice, "My name is Vesha, of the Stillwater clan." Kylam had said, "Vesha." He had said, "Please come." He had walked with her the 12 paces to the small inn at the side of the wagon road. He had hired from the innkeeper a second horse, a small gray mare of even temper, for the half-day ride south to his own farm. He had paid the innkeeper $4 in advance. He had helped Vesha into the saddle, and he had mounted his own bay mare, and the 2 of them had ridden together south down the wagon road out of Salt Hollow Crossing at the cool, clear hour of mid-morning, and the 18 men of the auction had watched them go, and none of those 18 men on that morning had known that they were watching the beginning of a thing that the territory was going to argue about for the next 28 years. He had been 44 years old that April, and he had been the freeholder of the farm of Hess at the crossroads of Salt Hollow for 19 of those years, and he had been the son of a Welsh hill farmer who had crossed in the second wave after the Great Hunger, and he had taken his 80 acres at the edge of the territory at 25 for $140 cash and a promise of 15 years improvement. And he had paid the promise. He had married Mara of the same Welsh families at 28, and they had raised one son, Tolan, who was 22 that April, and they had been happy. Mara had died of a fever in the autumn of 1850, 3 years before the auction, and Kylam had not remarried. He had been carrying the copper coin in his pocket since the autumn of 1851. He had been thinking, since Mara's death, about the kinds of things a man does in the second half of his life when he has been given more time than his wife was given, and one of the things he had decided about was the auction at Salt Hollow Crossing that he had ridden past 3 times that year, and that had begun to disturb his sleep on the nights after he had ridden past it. He had not known on the morning of April the 18th, when he had ridden up the wagon road from the south with the copper coin still in his pocket, whether the auction was going to be in operation in that day. He had ridden up the road because his son Tolan had asked him to ride to Salt Hollow for a length of pine planking The lumber yard at the crossroads carried that the lumber yard at the county seat did not. He had ridden up the road in his ordinary working clothes, a brown wool coat over a white linen shirt, dark wool trousers, brown leather suspenders, brown leather boots, and a wide-brimmed brown felt hat, with no plan in his head beyond the lumber yard, and he had reached the crossroads at the hour the auction had been in operation for 2 hours, and he had seen Hessel brace on the platform, and he had walked the bay mare 3 paces past the crowd before he had understood what he was about to do. He had bought the lumber after the auction. He had loaded it on the small gray mare's saddle. Vesha of the Stillwater had ridden the rest of the way home behind him on the wagon road south to the farm of Hess, and they had reached the farm at the warm gold hour of late afternoon, and Tolan had met them at the gate. Tolan had been at the front pasture mending the wagon rail when his father had come down the road, and he had walked to the gate when he had seen that there were 2 horses, and he had stopped at the gate when he had seen the silver-haired orc woman in the torn gray dress and the unmatched shoes sitting upright on the gray mare with her dark eyes fixed on the white-painted door of the small farmhouse. Caleb had ridden the bay mare to the gate. He had dismounted. He had said, "Tolan." Tolan had said, "Father." Caleb had said, "This is Vesha of the Stillwater." He had said, "Vesha came home with me from Salt Hollow today." He had said, "She is going to be a free woman of the territory tomorrow afternoon, and between now and then, she is going to be a guest of this farm." He had said, "Would you please help her down from the gray mare?" Tolan, who was a young man of 22, and who had been raised by Mara of the Welsh families for the first 19 years of his life, and who had taken his mother's death very hard, had walked to the side of the gray mare and had looked up at Vesha and had said, in the public language, "Ma'am, may I help you down?" Vesha had looked at him. She had said, in the low, quiet, clear voice, "Yes." Tolan had reached up and had taken her by the elbow and the wrist and had helped her down from the saddle to the spring mud beside the gate, and she had stood there for a moment to find her feet, and Tolan had not let go of her elbow until she had nodded once at him, and then he had let go and had stepped back. Caleb had said, "Tolan, please show Vesha to the back bedroom of the house." Tolan had said, "Father, yes." He had walked Vesha up the path to the front door of the small farmhouse, and he had held the door for her, and he had shown her up the narrow stairs to the back bedroom, which had been Mara's sewing room when Mara had been alive, and which Caleb had not entered since Mara's death, except to dust on the first Sunday of the month. And Tolan had said, "Ma'am, my mother kept this room for her sewing." He said, "The bed is freshly made." He said, "Please ring the small bell on the table if you need anything." He said, "Supper will be at 6 downstairs." He said, "Please rest." He had closed the door behind him. He had come down the stairs. He had said to his father, who was waiting in the front parlor, "Father." Caleb had said, "Tolan." Tolan had said, "I do not know the right question to ask you." Caleb had said, "I do not know the right answer to give you." He had said, "Please sit." Tolan had sat. Caleb had told his son, in the slow, even voice of a man who had been preparing for the conversation for 2 years without knowing the day, what he had been doing that morning at Salt Hollow Crossing, and what he had been thinking since Mara's death about the auction at the crossroads, and what he had bought in his pocket for the past 18 months, and what he had paid for it that morning. He had said, "Tolan, I have not done this in your name. I have done this in my own name and on my own land. and I have not yet asked you whether you approve, and I am asking you now." Tolan had looked at his father for a long moment. He had said, in a voice that was steady, "Father," he had said, "you do not need my approval to do a thing on your own land in your own name." He had said, "But you have it." They had ridden to the territorial registrar's office at the county seat the next morning. Caleb had filed the bill of sale at the registrar's window at 9 o'clock and had paid the $4 recording fee. And at the same window with the same clerk, he had filed a manumission paper, dated the same date, freeing Vesha of the Stillwater clan from any further claim by any party, including himself, and he had paid the additional $2 recording fee for the manumission. The clerk, a man of 40 named Wendell, whom Caleb had known for 15 years, had stamped both documents with the seal of the territorial registrar of the county of Salt Hollow on the morning of April the 19th, 1853, and had filed the duplicates in the registrar's permanent record and had handed the originals to Caleb across the counter. Caleb had handed the manumission paper to Vesha. Vesha had not taken it. She had said, in the low, quiet voice, "Mr. Hess, I would like you to hold this paper for 1 year." Caleb had said, "Vesha." She had said, "Mr. Hess, I have been a slave for 8 years. She said, "I have been a free woman of my people for 50 years before that, and I have been the principal smith of my village in the Eastern campaigns. And I know what a free woman looks like, and I know what it feels like to be one, and I am not at this moment a free woman, because a free woman does not stand at a county registrar's counter on the morning after she has been bought at an auction, with no clothes she owns and no money in her pocket and no roof of her own and no people of her own to ride to, and accept a piece of paper from a man she has known for 14 hours. She said, "Mr. Hess, please hold this paper for 1 year, and I will work at your farm for 1 year. And at the end of the year, I will come to you, and I will take the paper, and I will read it in front of you, and then I will be a free woman." Caleb had folded the manumission paper and had put it inside his Bible at his bedside that evening, and he had not opened the Bible to that page for the next 12 months. Vesha had worked at the farm of Hess for the next 12 months. She had begun, in the second week, with the kitchen, because the kitchen had been Mara's domain and had not been properly run in 3 years, and Tolan had been eating cold biscuits and dried bacon for the better part of his post-mother life. She had moved, in the second month, to the kitchen garden, because the kitchen garden had not been properly weeded in 3 years either. She had moved, in the third month, to the small farm forge at the back of the barn, because she had walked past the forge for 2 months, looking at it sideways without saying anything, and had finally asked Caleb on the 1st of July whether the forge was being used, and Caleb had said no, and Vesha had said, "Mr. Hess, may I work it?" Caleb had said, "Vesha, please." By the autumn of 1853, Vesha of the Stillwater clan had begun shoeing the horses of the farm of Hess and of the 4 neighboring farms within a 3-mile radius, in the particular blue-black sheen of iron quenched in still water. That was the mark of her clan, and the farmers of the 4 neighboring farms had begun to ride past the farm of Hess on Tuesday afternoons with horses that needed shoeing, and with the careful frontier civility of men who had decided to ignore for the time being the question of who the smith on the Hess farm was, in exchange for the simple practical fact that the smith was the best smith they had ever met. By the 1st of April of 1854, on the anniversary of the auction, Vesha had walked into the front parlor of the farmhouse at the warm gold hour of late afternoon, and she had stood in front of Calum's reading chair, and she had said, "Mr. Hess." Calum had said, "Vesha." She had said, "The year is up." Calum had walked up the stairs to his back bedroom and had retrieved the manumission paper from inside his Bible and had carried it down to the parlor, and he had handed it to Vesha. Vesha had taken it. She had unfolded it. She had read it aloud in her steady, low voice all the way through, from the date line at the top, through the territorial seal at the bottom. She had refolded it. She had said, "Mr. Hess, thank you." She had said, "I will continue to work at your farm because I have come to like the work, and because the forge has become my forge, and the kitchen garden has become my kitchen garden, and I will continue to be paid for the work, because that is the arrangement of free people, and I will go to my own people at the Stillwater settlement on the Third River when I have saved the journey." She had said, "But I am a free woman of the territory as of this afternoon, and I would like you to know that I know it." Calum had said, "Vesha, I know." Lord Andros Vellon had sued for the recovery of Vesha of the Stillwater on the 14th of May, 1854, in the Territorial Circuit Court at the Central County seat. He was a man of 52, the owner of a large estate to the south of Salt Hollow, with 200 orcs in service on his land and a network of paper claims across the territory that he had been quietly building for the previous 15 years. He had presented to the court a forged bill of original purchase, dated 1837, claiming Vesha of the Stillwater as a property of his estate that had been lost during the Eastern campaigns and that had now reappeared at the farm of Hess. He had argued that the auction at Salt Hollow Crossing had not had the legal authority to dispose of an orc whose original ownership was on record in his own ledger. He had retained a lawyer from the territorial capital. The case had been heard by the territorial circuit judge, an old man named Pelham, who had known Calum's father in the early days of the Central Plains settlement, and who had known Lord Andros Vellon for somewhat longer, and had not formed a favorable opinion of him. Calum had retained no lawyer. He had walked into court on the morning of the hearing with the bill of sale of April the 18th and the manumission paper of April the 19th in a small leather portfolio, and he had laid both documents on the bench in front of Judge Pelham, and he had said, "Your Honor, my purchase is registered at the county registrar's office, and my manumission is registered at the same office, both dated 13 months ago and stamped with the territorial seal." He had said, "Your Honor, the woman who is the subject of this suit has been a free woman of the territory for the past 12 months, and the suit is therefore not a suit for the recovery of property, but a suit for the re-enslavement of a free woman, which is a suit the territorial courts cannot hear under the Act of 1849. Judge Pelham had read both documents. He had read Lord Vellon's forged bill. He had ruled from the bench that the bill presented by Lord Vellon was an instrument of doubtful provenance, which the court would not be entering into the territorial record, that the manumission of Vesha of the Stillwater was a properly executed instrument of the territorial registrar's office, which the court would not disturb, and that the suit was dismissed with prejudice at the cost of the petitioner. Lord Andros Vellon had not appealed. He had walked out of the courtroom. He had not spoken to Calum Hess again in the remaining 6 years of his life. He had died of a stroke in the autumn of 1860 at the age of 59. Vesha had outlived him by 34 years, the years between 1854 and 1868 passed. Vesha worked the forge at the farm of Hess for those years. She did not move to the Stillwater settlement on the Third River. She had ridden out once in the second year in the spring of 1856 on a small gray mare Calum had bought her, and she had ridden the 8 days east to the river, and she had sat for 2 weeks with the elders of the Stillwater settlement, and she had ridden back. She had built up the forge across the next decade. She had taken on her first apprentice in 1858, a young human boy from a neighboring farm named Eli, whose father had asked Vesha if his son could learn the craft. She had taken on her second apprentice in 1861, a young Orc man named Corm, of the Stillwater clan, whom the elders had sent to her on her own request. By 1865, she had 3 apprentices and a small forge shed of her own that Calum had helped her build at the back of the farm, beside the kitchen garden, on a small piece of the 80 acres that Calum had marked off in 1857 as Vesha's own freehold under a separate parcel registration at the county seat. The freehold had been 4 acres. It had been recorded in her own name. By 1868, the freehold had grown to 7 acres by Calum's additional grants, and Vesha of the Stillwater had become a person of some standing in the Central Plains country, who corresponded by letter with the Smiths of 2 other Stillwater settlements in the territory, and with 3 human farriers, and with the territorial registrar's office on routine matters, and who had not married and had not had children of her own, but who had become, by the calculations of the 4 families now living on her 7 acres, including Corm and his wife and 3 young Orc apprentices, the matriarch of a small Stillwater household at the eastern edge of a human farm. Lord Gareth Vellon had ridden onto the farm of Hess on the 14th of August, 1868, with 12 hired men. He was the son of Lord Andres Vellon, 38 years old at that time, and he had been telling the men of his estate for the previous 2 years that he intended to recover the property his father had lost at the territorial court in 1854, and he had hired the 12 men out of the eastern foundries that summer, and he had ridden them up the wagon road to the farm of Hess on a Friday afternoon at 3 o'clock, with the intention of taking Vesha of the Stillwater out of her own forage shed and carrying her south to the Vellon estate. He had not made it past the front gate. Calum Hess had been waiting at the front gate with his rifle at his side, and his son Tolan, now 37, and the foreman of the Hess farm, with his rifle beside his. Behind the 2 of them at the front fence in a loose line stood the 4 farmers of the neighboring farms within the 3-mile radius, with their adult sons and their hired hands and their rifles, and at the eastern fence behind the kitchen garden stood Corm of the Stillwater and his 2 adult apprentices and 4 men of the Stillwater settlement who had ridden in from the Third River the previous week on a letter Vesha had sent them 10 days before. There were in total around the farm of Hess on that Friday afternoon 31 men with rifles. Lord Gareth Vellon had ridden up the wagon road with his 12 hired men. He had stopped at the front gate. He had looked at Calum Hess. He had looked at Tolan Hess. He had looked at the 4 farmers at the front fence and at the line of men at the eastern fence. He had not dismounted. He had said, in a voice that did not carry confidence well, Mr. Hess. Caleb had said, Lord Velen. Lord Velen had said, I am here on the matter of the orc your family bought at auction in 1853. Caleb had said, Lord Velen, the woman who lives at the eastern edge of this farm is a free woman of the territory, under the seal of the territorial registrar of this county, and she has been a free woman for 15 years and 4 months. He had said, your father raised this matter in court in 1854 and lost. He had said, you are welcome to raise the matter in court again, in which case I will meet you in court again. He had said, you are not welcome to ride onto my freehold with 12 men and a rope, and I would like you to turn your horses around now and ride them back the way you came, and I would like you to do this in the next 90 seconds, after which the men at this fence and at the eastern fence are going to begin to fire. Lord Gareth Velen had counted for himself the 31 rifles at the fences. He had looked at his 12 hired men. He had said, Mr. Hess. Caleb had said, Lord Velen, ride. Lord Gareth Velen had turned his horse. He had ridden the wagon road back south with his 12 hired men. He had sued the following month in the territorial court at the central county seat. The same Judge Pelham, now 71, and on the last year of his bench, had heard the case. He had ruled in 17 words from the bench that the matter had been settled in 1854, and that the suit was barred by the doctrine of res judicata, and he had dismissed it with prejudice. Lord Gareth Velen had not appealed. He had died of yellow fever in the summer of 1869 at the age of 39. Vesha had outlived him by 25 years. The years between 1868 and 1881 passed. Caleb Hess had grown old at the farm of Hess. He had handed over the foreman's work to Tolan in 1873 at the age of 64. He had taken to sitting on the front porch of the farmhouse in the warm gold afternoons of the summer and to reading the Bible in the cool gray mornings of the winter, and he had received Vesha of the Stillwater for tea on the front porch every Sunday afternoon at 4 o'clock for the entire decade of the 1870s, in which the two of them sat across from each other on the wooden porch chairs and drank black tea with milk, and did not speak much. Vesha had continued to work the forge until 1879, when she was 84, and had begun to feel the work in her shoulders, and she had then turned the forge over to Corm, and had taken to her own porch on the eastern edge of the farm, and to receiving visitors in her own small parlor. Lord Tybald Velen had filed a third suit for the recovery of the property of the Velen estate in the spring of 1881. He was the grandson of Lord Andras Velen and the nephew of Lord Gareth Velen, 31 years old, an ambitious young man who had been telling the men of his own household for the previous 2 years that he intended to restore the honor of the Velen name by recovering the orc his grandfather had lost at law in 1854. He had retained an expensive lawyer from the territorial capital. The lawyer had read the file. The lawyer had ridden to Lord Tybald's estate in the second week of the case, and had sat with Lord Tybald in his front parlor, and had said, "My lord, the matter was settled in 1854. It was settled again in 1868. The free woman in question is now 86 years old. She is a person of standing in 3 counties. She has a household of 14 and a forge that supplies the Central Plains region. The judge of the Territorial Circuit Court is the son of Judge Pelham, who has read the previous 2 opinions in his father's hand, and who has told me privately last week that he will not hear this case. The lawyer had said, "My lord, there is no court in this territory that will hear this case." He had said, "My lord, withdraw it." Lord Tybald Velen had withdrawn the suit on the 3rd of May, 1881, 28 years and 15 days after Calum Hess had bid 1 copper coin at the auction block at Salt Hollow Crossing. Lord Tybald had died of a hunting accident in the autumn of the following year, at the age of 32. Vesha had outlived him by 12 years. Calum Hess died on a clear morning in October of 1892, at the age of 83, in his own bed in the small farmhouse at the crossroads of Salt Hollow, with Tolan and Tolan's wife and Tolan's 3 children around him, and Vesha of the Stillwater sitting beside him in the wooden chair Mara had once sat in, holding his right hand in both her green-painted hands. He was buried in the small Welsh plot at the back of the farm beside Mara. Vesha did not speak at the burial. She walked back to her own porch on the eastern edge of the farm, and she sat on it for 2 days, and she did not eat. And on the 3rd morning she came down to the kitchen and resumed her ordinary work. She lived another 2 years. She died on a clear, cold morning in March of 1894, at the age of 99, in her own small bed in her own house, with Corm of the Stillwater and his wife and their 4 children and 17 of the Stillwater household around her. She was buried in the small Stillwater plot at the eastern edge of the farm, beside 2 of her apprentices who had gone before her. The 7 acres at the eastern edge of the farm of Hess, registered in her own name in 1857 under separate parcel at the county seat, passed by her own will to Corm of the Stillwater clan and to his descendants in perpetuity. The Stillwater household at the eastern edge of the farm of Hess grew over the following century into a small Stillwater settlement of perhaps 40 households, which by 1940 had become known as the Stillwater Hollow Forge, and which by the present day produces, in the same blue-black quenched iron of the Eastern campaigns, the horseshoes and plowshares and household tools of 3 counties. The forge is still in operation. The original bill of sale of the 18th of April, 1853, recorded at the county registrar's office for 1 copper coin, is held in the archives of the County Historical Society at the Central County seat. The original manumission paper of the 19th of April, 1853, is held in a glass case in the front parlor of the Stillwater Hollow Forge, where the apprentices touched the glass on their first day of work for luck. Did you enjoy the story? Subscribe to the channel to watch more stories like this one. Leave a like. It helps the channel a lot. And drop a comment down below. I always read them and use your feedback to make our content better. Thanks so much. The Orc Keeper.